Have you ever felt like this? Now, I don't blame you. Seminary is a big calling. After all, we're asked to follow the example of the Master Shepherd. Although we may feel a little bit more like this. Teaching is hard work, but there are things that we can do that may not make it such a chore. Take a look at these dots. These represent all the kinds of things that we as seminary teachers need to do. That's a lot to keep track of. I wonder if I asked you to count these dots, if that also would feel overwhelming. But how about now? And how about now? And how about now? What makes the difference? I haven't moved the dots. There's still the same number of them. It's the idea of taking chaos and creating order. As we do things in an orderly manner, it can help us to manage what feels like an overwhelming task. Let's take lesson preparation. That could take as much time as there are hours in the day if we let it. I'm going to propose that seminary teachers should be able to prepare an effective lesson in less than an hour. Now, there are times when it may be longer and times when it may be shorter, but I don't want you to feel overwhelmed with your lesson. So let me break it down into a few steps. 4 steps to be exact. First of all, read the scripture block. Why? Because when we read the scripture block, that is when the Lord can open up our hearts to revelation. See, the lessons are excellent lessons, and they're well written, but they're written for a class, not necessarily your class. And of course, we don't just teach classes or lessons, we teach students. So you know your students, and the Lord can reveal to you if there are things that a student or more than one really needs to understand in the lesson that day. So as you read the block and read it with an eye for lessons that students could learn, doctrines, principles, this will get easier as the year goes on. But as you practice looking for those, you'll be able to find things that can help your students, and you'll know where to emphasize your lesson. And that's the next part. What's most important? Examine in the lesson materials what is the most important thing. And you'll know that from what you read. As you read the scripture block, the Lord will prompt your mind for certain things that you could emphasize. And that's where you want to spend most of your time. We can't teach everything that's in the lesson. So we need to be judicious about what we use for our students. Next, mark the manual. You'll focus on the areas that are most important. And then on the other areas, we don't want to skip those, so we will Summa Phi, and I'll explain that in a minute. 10 to 15 minutes to read the scripture block for something like Doctrine and Covenants section 13. It will be considerably less than some of the longer sections, but on average, about 10 to 15 minutes to read the block, looking for and even marking lessons, doctrines, principles that will be valuable to your students. Then examine the lesson manual, 3 minutes. Look over, once you've picked now what you think or 1 or 2 things that are most important, then go ahead and find those things in the manual and emphasize that. I would recommend even writing a period of time next to the scripture block in your lesson manual for how long you plan on taking with the lesson. 25 minutes to mark the rest of the manual, or to mark the manual, especially the most important parts. And then Summa Phi the areas that you're not going to be able to spend as much time. In the Doctrine and Covenants, it makes it pretty easy because it already divides it into verse groupings. Consider the verse groupings to be paragraphs. Verses are not paragraphs. They are arbitrary chunks of text numbered for the ease of use in study. So when you read Doctrine and Covenants this year, look at verses, say here, 1 through 7. Use those as your groups to look for doctrines and principles. What do I see in verses 1 through 7 that are important truths, or 8 through 16? Now you come to the lesson manual. Let's say I really want to emphasize this first part. Of course, we're introducing the Doctrine and Covenants as the Lord's preface, so it's an important section. So I'll begin to mark. Now I mark in 3 colors, and I'll recommend this to you. 1 color for questions that you want to ask. You don't need to mark all the questions, although in this particular section there's a number of them that I will be marking. But mark the questions that are most important that you want to make sure to ask, or mark the segment of the question that you want to make sure to ask. Now, I use red, underline instructions to the teacher. What are things the manual wants you, the teacher, to do? And of course, you don't need to underline everything, but underline pieces that will help you to remember what it is. The way you mark your manual, you should be able to glance down and quickly see exactly where you are and what's coming up. So here we have a scripture reference. That's your 3rd color. So 1 color for questions, 1 color to underline, and another color to highlight the scripture verses that the manual is having you to search. And you may choose, depending on time, to trim those or make adjustments. But if this is an area that I really want to focus on, this is how I would mark it. Here are some more instructions. These are instructions to the students for what to do when one of the other students reads. They're to follow along, and then I always identify or underline the instructions that I should tell the students to pay attention for while the student reads. So on you go in the lesson, continuing to mark questions or portions of questions, scripture references, instructions. Remember to just mark what's most important for you to be able to glance down and see, to kind of find your place in the lesson. Now here's an example where rather than the scripture reference, Doctrine and Covenants 1, verse 17, it wants the class to scan that and identify words that the Lord used and so on. So I'll underline scan as an instruction. Now you should take some time, grab a lesson out of your manual, and try it. Now you may say, hey, I've got my own system. But try this and see if it can help to give you ideas to be more efficient, effectively, in your lesson preparation. Now let's take a look at what it means to Summa Phi. This is a term our area director came up with. It means to summarize and testify. Summa Phi. Here's how it would look. There's 4 steps. Step 1, announce the verse block. It's so easy. Then read the summary statement. In your lesson manual, right below the verse block, there is a summary statement. Just read it. Then discover a doctrine or principle in that section. Most all scripture blocks have them. What we're using that for, this would be the bolded section of the manual. There would be a truth, doctrine or principle that they want the students to discover. So see what you need to do in order to help your students to discover it, and then testify of the doctrine or principle that they've discovered. So here's how it would look. I'm going to do the first part right now. So class, in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verses 1 through 16, the Lord warns of the judgments that will come upon the rebellious at the second coming. I've just done step 1 and 2. So now I'm going to look through and find the doctrine and principle. There it is, bolded below. The Lord speaks his warnings to all people through his chosen disciples. Now, what do I need to help students to discover that? In other words, what's the most important elements of this lesson material? So go backwards from there. Find your doctrine or principle and then go backward. What's the question that led to the discovery? How did the Lord say he would deliver his warnings to all people? Well, what scriptures are they using in order to know the answer to that question? Well, there it is. Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verses 4 through 7. But having prepared this already, I know that even though I need to really summarize this, and I don't know why I would summarize this particular one. This is just an example. But this is the introduction to the Lord's preface. And if this is a truth that I really want to spend a lot of time on, I'm not going to Summa Phi this section. But if there's a later part that I want to make sure to really be able to spend time with, maybe have a class discussion around, then even though there's some wonderful parts, we're going to have to summarize them. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time and we're going to end up skipping them. So I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do the whole display your copy of the Doctrine and Covenants and explain what this book contains. That should only take a moment. And I'm going to explain what a preface is, because that's important. And then I'm going to have the students look at Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verse 1. Now, it has 1 through 3, but when I looked at the verses, the answer really is found right away in verse 1. So to save time, I'm just going to hit that, and I'm going to have them follow along looking for words and phrases the Lord used to get the attention of those. But I really like this question here too. To whom was the Lord speaking in this verse? Because it's important, I think, to realize that it's not just to the church, but to the whole world. So I'll hit that question, but I also, in my mind, realize I don't need to spend too much time on that. So then I'll have time for the Doctrine and Covenants, verses 4 through 7. And honestly, I could trim that down to just verses 4 and 5 if I wanted to. I could make a note for myself and then ask that question. So if I were to run this through, I would encourage you to test yourself and see if you can summify a section in your lesson and present it effectively in 3 minutes. If I were to do it, it might be something like this. All right, I'm going to announce the first block, going to read the summary statement, going to discover doctrine and principle, testify. All right, I think I'm ready with my lesson. So here we go. So class, in Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verses 1 through 16, the Lord warns of the judgments that will come upon the rebellious at the second coming. See that? I just did step 1 and step 2. But the timer's still going. So let's take a look here. I'm going to hold up my copy of the Doctrine and Covenants to my class and say that in this book, the Lord provides warnings, commandments, and instructions that are crucial for our happiness and salvation. The Lord revealed this section 1, as a preface. A preface prepares the reader for the contents of a book by summarizing the message and the purposes of the author. Let's take a look. Ethan, would you look in Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verse 1? Would you read that out loud? And while he's reading that, would the rest of you follow along and identify words and phrases the Lord used to get the attention of those who would read his words? Fantastic. Thank you. And what did you catch there? Hearken. Exactly right. So what does that mean? So to whom was the Lord speaking in these verses? See, right, it wasn't just the disciples, it was the whole world. Well done. Let's take a look. Tristan, if you would read Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, just verses 4 and 5 would do it. And while he is reading that, would you follow along and identify how the Lord said he would deliver his warnings to his people? The student will read that scripture, and then I'd restate the question if need be. Well, how? How is the Lord? How did he say that he would deliver his warnings? Excellent. Through his chosen disciples. Now, this would have been a good time to testify of that principle that they discovered, but I want to take it one step further on this one, and so I'd ask that next question. Who are the disciples through whom the Lord speaks and publishes his warnings today? And then I'd let the students answer, and as they talked about the general authorities, I would testify. I would say, I know the Lord speaks his warnings to all people through his chosen disciples. And then you go on. That's how you Summa Phi. You help the students discover a principle that you can testify of or share a testimony. In that case, you could say, I know. If one of the other students had brought something up about who the disciples are today, I know that these people are true disciples of the Lord through whom we can trust their message. And then you move on. Let me reemphasize, and I hope this doesn't need to be reemphasized, but I don't want any mistakes. To Summa Phi a section is just for sections that you want to spend more time elsewhere. And so you can teach these sections effectively in just a few minutes. And you may get to the end of a lesson and realize, oh no, I only have a few minutes. But if you're practiced at doing this, you can say, okay, and you can, on the fly, Summa Phi that lesson rather than say, well, I guess we don't have time to go into this. When you're done with your lesson, it can be a valuable exercise to follow the instruction of Elder Henry B. Eyring. He says this: after a class, you might find a moment to pray that you might see clearly what happened in the class and what happened in the lives of the students. You may do it your own way, but the way I like to do it is something like this. I ask, was there something I said or did, or that they said or did, that lifted them? If you ask in prayer, humbly, and in faith, you will sometimes, perhaps often, have moments during that class brought back to your memory of a look on a student's face, or the sound in a student's voice, or even the way the student sat up and leaned forward at some point in the lesson that will give you a reassurance that they were lifted. But more important than that, it can give you a chance to learn. You can learn what happened in the classroom and, therefore, what you can do to bring those lifting experiences to your students again and again.